Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Napoleon Bonaparte died on May the 5th, 1821. Maximillian Robespierre was born on May the 6th, 1758. Which means these two anniversaries sit beside each other on the calendar. It's almost like a grim little joke from Providence that Robespierre, he was a revolutionary lawyer. He preached virtue through terror. He tore down, or at least architected the tearing down, of the old Christian order of France. And Napoleon was, of course, the military genius who won so much conquest that he crowned himself emperor and marched through the ruins that were left in the wake of the French Revolution. Robespierre is often treated as an unfortunate extremist. This is the narrative we're given. He was an unfortunate extremist within a noble political awakening. It's a convenient way for modern ideologues to avoid noticing that he was a conclusion. He had an intent here. The French Revolution began by declaring man sovereign over God. And then it proceeded with the grim logic of every utopian project. It tried to build heaven on earth through committees and tribunals and slogans and the guillotine, eventually blood. The revolution did a lot of things at once. It was chaos. There was no order and system behind it. Its deepest damage, however, came through its assault of the Catholic faith in France. It understood that, with chilling intelligence I might add, that if the church remained the moral mother of the people, then the revolution could never possess the soul of France entirely. So the altar of the Catholic Church had to be subordinated to the assembly. The Catholic priest had to be remade into a functionary under the civil government. And the sacred rhythm of the Christian time, including the liturgical calendar, had to be replaced by the absurd calendar of the vanity of the French Revolution. The civil constitution of the clergy, this was in 1790, it forced clergy to swear loyalty to the revolutionary state of France that was now trying to assume complete authority over the life of the church in France. And that act immediately split France's religious body between constitutional clergy, those who submitted obedience to the state, and refractory clergy, those who still held to fidelity to the magisterium. Catholic fidelity became a political crime virtually overnight. So these new apostles of liberty, equality, and compulsory bureaucratic salvation, they sought blood. And the entrails of the priests would be the first things that would unfortunately stain the streets. These revolutionaries were always fond of freedom until actual people freely disagreed with them. So the regime soon moved from reform into outright coercion, and then from coercion to persecution, from persecution to murder. Their public vocabulary, though, was pleasant. They called it virtue, citizenship, humanity, progress. Robespierre's political religion replaced Christian sanctification and holiness. Instead, now, you had to be a pure revolutionary. This was far more dangerous than ordinary corruption. Corrupt men usually know they are corrupt. Ideological Puritans are coerced to belief that their cruelty is in the cause of justice, and so it's actually true compassion. The reign of terror, as it's called now, it was a grotesque sacrament, lowercase s, of a godless civic faith. The guillotine was its new altar. And so the Committee of Public Safety acted as the new priests of France, the civic priests of France, and they demanded victims, particularly Catholic priests, with a steady appetite, constant public executions. And that's precisely what happens when politics is severed from divine judgment. The state begins to imagine itself as its own redeemer. History is the raw material that it can rewrite its narratives, and the citizens are at the service of this narrative. And if you dissent, well, you're an obstacle, and obstacles need to be eliminated. Catholic France suffered horribly under this madness. Through the suppression of religious orders, the seizure of church property, forced closure of monasteries, mockery of Christian worship, the cults of reason and the supreme being, and the slaughter of Catholics, especially in places like Vendée, the ordinary peasants rose up because they wanted their priests, their mass, their parishes, their ancestral faith. They didn't want the philosophical enlightened dictatorship of men who loved mankind so much that they had no patience for real persons. That's why the Vendée remains one of the great moral indictments of revolutionary modernity, because here was the simple Catholic countryside resisting a regime that spoke endlessly about human rights, but it was crushing those who exercised those free rights, especially the right to worship God according to one's conscience. But the revolution didn't just injure France, it injured Europe. It exported the myth that liberty requires liberation from Christ and his church. It was one of the most poisonous ideas in modern political history. Once nations began to believe that Christian civilization was an obstacle to human flourishing, they became vulnerable to every later ideology that promised emancipation through the destruction of the inherited moral order of the church. And then came Napoleon. Napoleon was in many ways the child of the revolution, but he also became the undertaker of its chaos. He inherited a France that was exhausted by bloodshed and faction and confiscation. In fact, by that point, France was even tired of the de-Christianization and the revolutionary fantasy. So what does he do? He enters the fore, he sees what's going on, and he gathers the wreckage. And he does this under the power of his will. Gathered an army to himself. He was an administrative genius, and his immense personal ambition took charge. Napoleon gave France some political stability after years of chaos under the revolution. Many people welcomed the end of street politics and guillotine politics. They were grateful for a man on horseback who simply makes the trains run, so to speak. But France needed order long before anyone needed another committee explaining the moral glory of disorder. But Napoleon did more than restore order. He converted revolutionary energy into imperial power. He showed that revolutions rarely end in the niceties that they promise. They end with a uniform and a crown and a police apparatus and a continent full of graves. So what does he do? He signs the Concordat of 1801 with Pius VII. That agreement opened space for Catholic worship again after the worst persecutions in France. But even there, Napoleon treated the church as a useful institution for himself. That's how clever rulers handle religion. They respect its power, but they don't submit to the Lord God of hosts. And so the revolution tried to enthrone the people. Robespierre tried to enthrone virtue. Napoleon enthroned himself. It's the same spiritual disease, the refusal to receive reality as ordered by God. Napoleon's wars spread revolutionary principles across Europe, armies, codes, administrations, occupations, you name it. All of these was the consequence of the militarization of the same revolutionary modernity. And so the dream of remaking society was fused with the machinery of the state and the ambitions of Napoleon. Europe paid dearly for this. The old Christian order was weakened, almost dead. Monarchies were trembling. Churches were plundered. Religious communities had been displaced. And so national resentments were intensifying. The moral imagination of the West was trained to believe that history could be mastered by force if the right man had enough will and force. And that's why Napoleon's death on St. Helena has a kind of pathetic ring to it. The man who once rearranged thrones across Europe died far from France on a remote island. After all his battles and proclamations and campaigns, he finally collapsed into the smallness of his own mortality. Robespierre, in the same way, met his end by the very system he designed. I mean, literally, he was taken up to the guillotine, that same apparatus of suspicion and blood that he put in the public sphere. But the church endured that storm because she belongs to Christ, not to Paris, not to emperors, not to ideologues, to Christ. Catholic France was deeply wounded, but the faith survived. Grace cannot be nationalized. The lesson for all of us here is learn from history, to be sure. France's tragedy teaches us that any authority without the altar of the church becomes vanity, and that kind of power corrupts absolutely. Christians, we should study Robespierre and Napoleon, and we should pay attention. One of it shows the madness of virtue severed from grace. The other shows the futility of ambition severed from humility. Together, they announce the same final truth. You cannot have a humanity and a society without Jesus Christ. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter.